the regime now has a problem of use it or lose it when we're talking about their ballistic missiles, especially if they're under extreme threat. As the Iranian regime will begin to go under, and it will, we don't know the exact timeline, obviously, not a prophet here. Today's webinar is about Iran and the possibility of a domestic collapse in 2026. Now, why did we decide to focus on this? For a very simple reason. We keep hearing about their rocket program, ballistic missiles, nuclear program. How damaged was it? How much can they recover? Okay, but really, what is the big issue? They're standing on very, very unstable soil. And therefore, as we'll be seeing, I'm going to be putting through a lot of info here with a fair amount of statistics and economic indicators here and there as to where Iran is going and how much time do they really have before the whole thing may go under. Now, I think everybody on this call remembers what happened with the old Soviet Union, right? There were all these threats right up through the end of the 1980s, and suddenly everything sort of disappeared. It didn't mean that Russia didn't recover, okay? But in any case, keep that in the background, in the back of our minds for a moment, and let's take a look. Possible domestic collapse, 2026. Look, I believe it's going to happen eventually. Maybe it won't be by the end of this summer. But I'll make the case that it sort of will be going in that direction. Shiite apocalypse, the threat of Israel. There's a race against the clock here because, let's remember, they are arming as fast as they can, and they're getting ready for a war against Israel, and basically neglecting, ignoring all those domestic crises. Where is the collapse? Water, energy, and agricultural failure. Something of which is spoken about a bit here and there, but generally it's an article with a few points, and then everybody gets on with it. What's going to happen, the clash between Israel and Iran, just like the discussions going on, or will be going on tomorrow in Washington, or actually it's in Florida, between Netanyahu and President Trump. So here we go. A bit of background, overview. Water depletion. How did it come about? Over construction of dam projects. Now here we have the Karkha Dam, which is outside of Tehran. And what you see here is it's fairly well full, but it's been tremendously depleted. Okay, what happened? How did all this take place? First of all, you have many of the rivers in Iran are blocked with enormous ecological damage downstream. Okay, people don't think about it. In other words, agriculture downstream has been very much affected. It's also been very hot. We all know it goes up to 50 degrees Celsius, meaning about 122, I think that is Fahrenheit, in the summer for several days. Plus, just think about it. If it's only 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or call it about 37 degrees Celsius, you also have enormous water evaporation. Okay, when you build dams, that's what happens. If you leave the water underground or in the rivers and it flows and it gets to where it needs to go, there's less so. Okay, and we always need to put in, there's mismanagement, corruption, as well as lack of planning. They did not think forward, and we'll get into it, how this all came about. But I'm just putting out the stats here, or the situation as it is at the moment. Not only the issues that we all know of global warming in Israel, we have this problem also. They've had 6 years of drought, in other words, been worse than it generally is. And historically, we know from Persian sources from 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, that it's a very dry climate, even if it can be quite cold. It doesn't have to be summer, broiling hot. It can be, 2 degrees centigrade and dry for a full month. The dams nationwide are a bit below 50% full, 43%. But where's the major crisis? The cities. Most of them, we use Tehran as the example, have between 10 and 12% of the dam capacity. That's it. And right now, it's winter. It has barely rained. This should have started raining in October. It's barely rained for the last 2.5, 3 months. And it's the worst winter that they've had, even when you add up the previous ones of the last few years. What do? They drilled, and we're talking over a 40-year period, 35, 40 years, drilled deep down right, into aquifers and have drained them. In other words, you're getting to a point where there are these non-refillable aquifers that the water is simply gone unless you repump water back into them from desalination plants. And Iran only has 3% desalination altogether for a population of some 92 million. As a result, you have not only out in farmland, but especially in the cities, sinkholes forming, and cities are sinking at something like 25 centimeters, some of them up to that amount per year, meaning that not only is it a physical collapse, but all your infrastructure that brings the water or electrical lines, whatever you want, that's underground, are going to be torn. Think about it, buildings on top of all this equipment, and it will tear. All right, we know there's 30% water loss in many of the major cities, as well as that the electrical grid having massive problems, okay, that they can't pump the water even, okay, and when you get to a certain level where the water is very, very low, there may be some there, but you can't really pump it. So there are rolling blackouts as well as water shortages for hours on end. Okay, there wasn't built a water system that's integrated completely. Therefore, the 43% of dams being filled nationwide doesn't really help if they're not connected to all the big cities as well. Okay, let's take a look. So, how did all this come about? Khomeini, who we know is the father of the revolution, he had a revolutionary ideal, besides being an Islamist and a Shiite extremist, on and on, but that the country had to be self-sufficient in agriculture. And what did that mean? That meant that Iran was not going to import its food. They had to be dependent on themselves. Remember, it's a Shiite Muslim regime in the Middle East where all the rest are Sunni, and therefore having quite a bit of clash with them. Did not want to be dependent on other Muslim countries. There aren't any other Shiite countries to be dependent on. So they said, we'll do it themselves. Now, traditionally, you had your Qanat irrigation system, which I'll show you on the right-hand side in a moment. But what they did with the water to make sure that people would get into agriculture is it was highly subsidized or even free in certain places, meaning there's going to be a lot of waste. We know that. Call it the farmers' lobby, but this time backed up by the great theologian. So let's take a look at the Qanat system, which is ancient, goes back thousands of years. What you have here is underground water. I'm doing it just very briefly, follow the cursor, and you have wells dug. However, what happens with it is you build a tunnel, just like we have up here, that brings the water through and then out into irrigated land, meaning that it rains, the waters are absorbed, the amount that would be absorbed in the ground and flow every year. And the farmers, of course, knew how much water they could depend on. And they weren't going to pump it because they didn't have pumps. And we're talking about a system that was used right up into the late 20th century. What happened? When you start drilling all the way down and you have your water table, which you see here with the dotted line, right? You have to take the water out from the water table up here where you can still get to it. But if the water table drops all the way down to the area of bedrock, right? And is out of reach already, and you've drained it, that's it. The entire Qanat system runs dry. In other words, this would just be a dry canal underground, right? And by the way, this was a brilliant way of farming that was developed in a fairly dry climate like Persia thousands of years ago, and now is becoming completely useless because the water is well below the Qanat. Okay? Plus, once the aquifers are dry, we know it, there'll be dust storms, farmers flee to the cities, there's overusage of all the water resources, and as we know, and you can look it up, the lakes are disappearing. Some of them are down to, 10, 15% of what they had been for thousands of years. This is a non-sustainable water bankruptcy. In other words, they conquered Mother Nature, and obviously you can never win against Mother Nature. She will always have the final word. So How did much of this come about? You had the Iranian Revolutionary Guard core military-industrial complex. We're all familiar with Eisenhower's parting speech, State of the Nation, in January of 1961, where he spoke about and warned about it in the American framework that this could take over the country, on, and that it was very bad for the economy, foreign affairs. He had many, many reasons. Nobody thought in those days, right? He went projected forward that there could be a middle level power like Iran that not only would have a military industrial complex, which we'll explain in a moment, but backed by theology. How to come about? Khomeini, the president of Iran today, he put together the Guard Corps, okay, in the war with Iraq in the early 1980s. It began 1980, 81. He established it, and by the way, it was successful on the battlefield, and then afterwards, you have all these discharged soldiers. What are you going to do with them? You want to make sure they're loyal. You want to make sure that that they can be called back if necessary, reserve duty, and you owe them a lot. And therefore, it set up frameworks, right, for the Guard Corps that actually own the infrastructure of the state. Now, what does that mean? You have shares, let's put it like that, in state industries. You're connected to them. You are the state. It ensures loyalty as well, because if someone goes to overthrow the state, it's not like I have nothing to lose. I, as a member of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, in particular if I'm an officer, I have everything to lose. Because I was part of this group, I could support an extended family, and we have all the political connections. Therefore, it ensures loyalty, right? And it's the way of embodying state and military as one. They own the water and electrical grid. There was obviously no environmental planning, or virtually none. And by the way, when experts started to say you can't do this, that, and the other, they were brushed off. And those who made too much noise ended up in jail. So they shut the hell up, or fled, or both. Okay? And to give an example, you have the Khatam al-Anbiya construction company, which dominates the economy. Something like 60% of all major industrial firms that are put, or projects that are put together, they run it, and it belongs to the Guard Corps. You have the Morabake Steel Company, which recently has been given the job of building an 800-kilometer pipeline, bringing desalinized water to Isfahan, one of the large cities in Iran that is running dry. It's being planned. It's said to will be done in 2 years. It'll take a lot longer than that. And most of the water is going to end up being used for industry as opposed for the people or agriculture. So even that's not going to work. It's going to make it more of a disaster. It just shows that nobody is really taking an interest in what's happening with the population. And by the way, 80% of the population does not want the regime that they have. Okay? So finally, the military industries and nuclear program, of course, also belong to the Guard Corps, who are ensconced as part of the state. So 2025-26 projected, okay, we don't have the budget yet. They put their budget together for March because that's when the Persian New Year begins. But it's the continuation, like the projected what will be spent on the military, okay, finishing up this year in March, is 9 to 17% of the overall budget. Most likely it's closer to 17%, but it's very hard to judge because the exchange rate of the real, as you'll see in a moment, is so inconsistent and, should we say, it's almost worthless. It's very hard to judge how much anything is worth. Now, taking a look at the energy economy, the infrastructure is outdated. Like we know, power plants and power lines and, transmissions, right? They're not really taking care of it. There's also a lack of refinery capabilities. And that is a result of neglect of the energy sector because you were just exporting whatever they have for cash in order to build the military. Okay? There was no civilian or domestic thinking, very little going forward. Okay, the best of the natural gas, which is clean, is exported to Iraq and Turkey for that foreign currency, and that's happened in this past year. And when you speak of the rest of the energy sector, they sell oil to China at prices the Chinese demand, which is very low, meaning that, and it's 90% of their oil. The rest, of course, they're keeping for themselves. Everything demands an upgrade, and one would think that Iran is energy rich, but in essence, they've made themselves fairly energy poor. Now, what about the nuclear project? Massive debt. Okay, that and the ballistic missiles and all the other military equipment, but those are the two main clauses here we'll deal with. The military program over the past 25 years, just take a look, not only in lost GDP, sanctions, and infrastructure in building it, right? Missile program and nuclear. The minimal, and I went through tons of statistics, they say the minimum loss is $500 billion, and they say that's the direct. In other words, how much did it cost you to build this stuff, and what is the infrastructure? However, I think it was the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, says that since 2012, it's up to $3 trillion because of sanctions that took place, lost income from a domestic economy that could have been supported, as well as all sorts of conflicts throughout the Middle East. They say that the Iranian economy is really like basically on the ropes. Okay, and I've always emphasized it's very important to know what goes on in the economy, right? Because then you know the depth of their ability to wage war or get through a crisis. And here you don't have a lot of depth. Yes, the military potential in the short run is very high, and that's one of the big problems, of course, that Israel has, and I'd say the Middle East in general. You take a look at the map, and you can see, by the way, and I'll point it out with the cursor here, you see where Qatar is, and you see the purple there? That's natural gas. That's why Qatar has so much money. I know it's a bit of a sideline, but people often ask, well, how does a small country have so much, money? They have the largest natural gas field in the Persian Gulf, by far. It's as large as Qatar, and where you see the line that cuts there, the northern part is Iranian, the southern part, which is 3/4, belongs to Qatar. Okay, so what are we looking at here with what I call economic Armageddon? And once again, a few stats. Didn't want to overdo it, but it is important. First of all, the priorities are non-sustainable. Military expenses, the way that they're pouring money in with the economy they have, cannot continue for a long time. They do get some help from Russia and from Qatar, apparently. Okay, so sanctions over the nuclear program, we know there was a snapback. Foreign currency reserves, take a look, between $25 and $30 billion, right? That's all they have. Compare that to Israel, where if I remember correctly, it's between 250 billion to 270 or whatever, okay? Just as an example. GDP 2024, nominal as it's called. In other words, how much is it worth as compared to other countries, as opposed to PPP, how much is it worth internally? That's less of our issue at the moment. Okay, so we're never sure because of the whole problem with the real, how much is it really worth, its exchange rate? Between $417 to $434 billion. And the GDP estimate for 2025 drops, and this is the IMF, to some $357 billion because of the collapse of their currency, as well as all the damages they suffered, not only from conflict with Israel, but you probably heard about the corruption that led to explosions in their ports and industries falling apart. So take a look at the exchange rate. The official exchange rate is about 42,000 rial to $1. However, the remittance or market value is 1.3 million. That's an enormous difference. Okay, so it's very hard to know how much is their economy really worth, but we do know, right, for those who went to figure out state budget worth close to 270 billion, right? And the military expenditures, let's call it this year, will probably be about 15%. Put down how much they make from gas and oil exports, only 67 billion, and export of drones to Moscow, but the Russians are now producing their own based on the Iranian model. So that number there of about 2 billion isn't going to be next year. The Russians are building their own. Drug cartels, which often are forgotten, them and Hezbollah, that's how Hezbollah has a lot of money, estimate 2 to 3 billion. And the Europeans are offering a lot of sanctions relief, but they say you have to give up the nuclear program, and their answer is absolutely not. In other words, they're heading on the road to Armageddon, and of course, that's directed against Israel. So let's take a look at what they're rebuilding and what has happened. We know about what's called the 12-day war, or we could say operation, because Israel's really been at war with Iran for a good few years, right? You can even take it all the way back to 2006, the second war in Lebanon against Hezbollah. So we know the Americans, Israel, and then the Americans did vast damage to their program, nuclear program, Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan. That's for sure, okay? How much exactly? Everybody's guessing it's something else, completely out of use, partially so, rebuilding. We don't know. We just know that they have been held up. War costs, once again, it's an estimate. Let's call it in the middle, $30 billion. It's quite a bit when your whole GDP is about 270 billion. Okay, Israel costs 12 billion. What's Israel's GDP? So once again, we don't have the final figures for 2025, but Israel's GDP said to be about 580 billion, maybe closer to 600 billion, despite 2 years of war, because of Israel's high-tech economy. Another sort of stat: Israel has 10 million people. There are over 90 million in Iran. So you start doing the math and you're seeing, wow, this country is really impoverished, right? They have less than half of Israel's GDP, but 9 times the population. Okay, yet they continue with the military investments, particularly drones, and yes, the ballistic missiles, that there are reports saying that it could be up to 100 a day, which seems a bit strange. That would mean like 3,000 a month. Other reports are saying, no, it's probably closer to 3,000 a year. It's still a fair amount, and Israel will have to deal with it. Of course, the quicker the pace, the faster Israel will need to respond. Okay, and are they rebuilding the nuclear project? Yes, the question is how quickly. So here it is, a race against the clock before there's a physical collapse as well as an internal uprising. Because you can imagine people without electricity and water, and their jobs are gone, and agriculture. The conservative-leaning population, that are the farmers out in the rural areas, have also fled to the cities, and they may be religious, but they don't like the regime because, after all, they just lost their income, farms, everything. Okay, let's take a look at Hezbollah and the Houthi allies just briefly. It's a map of South Lebanon. You have Israel has a few positions across the border where you see these blue boxes. Okay. There are 5 of them. So $1 billion went to Hezbollah in 2025, and they are so short on money. But Hezbollah is their ally in firing rockets at Israel when they'll be involved in a major clash, which they hope, of course, that they'll decide on the timing. It includes the rockets, right, and smuggling through Beirut port and along the coast. Hezbollah controls the whole Beirut area. All right. You have hundreds of millions going to the Houthis in Yemen, firing, ballistic rockets, missiles, a couple thousand kilometers. And also, you'd be surprised. You think of Yemen as a very backwards country, and it is, but they do have rocket and drone assembly capabilities, plus all the transfer of knowledge, weapons, technology. Excuse me. Okay, and Iraqi militias, Shiites, they get funded. It's not a lot of money. Okay. Okay, what else is happening on Israel's side? You have this Israel's Iron Beam deployment. Was in the news today. I mean, we know they're to be deployed. The laser system is to be deployed on Tuesday, the 30th of December. It's already been handed over as of today. Take a couple days to hook everything up. What does that mean? Get to that last. First of all, Israel has a multi-layered system of air defense. The Arrow 3, which is the most developed, let's say, of the systems up till now. 2,400 kilometer range. It could take out ballistic missiles. Very impressive. In other words, far away from Israel. The Arrow 2, 90 to 100 kilometers. David Sling, some 300 kilometers, right? And that is all the upper levels. Iron Dome that we've all seen and heard about, right? Because those are the rockets that are medium range that are generally the ones taken out, right? We know from what happened with Gaza with Hamas, but in particular with Hezbollah. So we see it all the time on the news, whereas the other three, less so, because a lot of those, they're ballistic missiles that are taken out, far away from us. Now, what's the iron beam, or 8 ton? It's up to 10 kilometers, 6 to 10, and that's to take out short-range rockets and some of the medium, right? It's done with a laser. Instead of spending with, like, Iron Dome, $50,000 a shot, okay? And we have, battle days where we spend tens of millions of dollars in taking out rockets fired at Israel. Here it's between $5 and $10. That's it, right? For the short range. Now, obviously, anything that's going to be much further, or further up, ballistic missiles, it costs money, but very worthwhile. Remember, last time during the 12-day war, there were, I think it was 3 times that the entire system was overloaded and rockets got through. We know about what happened in Weizmann Institute, what happened in Haifa, rockets landing in Bat Yam, right? And other, Ramat Gan, right? Even fired at the Kiryat, the main command center for the army in Tel Aviv, right? It was hit, but the rocket, the pieces of it landed not far from Israel's major command center. Okay, so this iron beam laser defense system now will be used against Hezbollah more than anyone else. Ballistic missiles coming in from Iran, that's not your defensive system. It's the others that will take them out further away. Okay, so time is running out in desperation. The Iranian priority, you would think, they say, okay, we have to shore ourselves up domestically. We have to put everything on hold for a few years. The population is furious with us. The answer to all that is no. Doesn't interest them. The Iranian priority is an apocalyptic jihad, a war against Israel. And time is running out, because if the whole thing goes under, it crashes, and the population rebels, yes, they can fire off missiles at that point. That's true. They most likely would rather do it beforehand. We have to remember who has their finger on the button. Even if only 10% support the regime, those are the ones who control the weapons, the firing systems, you name it. Instead of putting this aside and saving the country, we would say, no, it's much more important to destroy the state of Israel. It's like what's often been said when we speak about Hamas and Hezbollah and even Fatah, right? Supposedly the moderates, is that the problem here is that the objective is destruction of the state of Israel before even their own well-being. And we could compare this to those who speak of, Palestinian state. Very often they say, first we have to destroy Israel, then we'll have a state. It's like, we can't have one side by side. We can't live with them. Okay, and that's a mindset, in this case, it's very jihadi, apocalyptic one, because Iran is suffering from multiple socioeconomic dysfunctions. Okay, so the sanctions relief, they're not taking. The domestic infrastructure reform, not happening. 80% of Iranians demand regime change. Let's remember, the other 20% don't necessarily support. There are those who don't answer these questions. All right, the conservative religious areas, where they always had support for the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij, which is sort of your volunteers in this paramilitary framework, they come from those regions. And the populations there are turning against them. It's not so much against the religion, but against them for running the way they're running the state. They think they could consolidate support against Israel. That's what's spoken about. That's what they write about. I don't believe they believe it's true. All right? And it's all a matter of timing. When will this crisis hit a peak? My estimate, it has to be by the end of summer. Remember, summer goes through October. And if this winter is particularly dry, they're really in for trouble. They may be able to squeeze by. Who knows? Maybe another year. You have this drought, right? That just doesn't end. One could expect extreme unrest, and the regime is cornered. Let's remember something. They have no place to flee. It's not like they can say, okay, that's it. We're out of here. We quit. The only place that could possibly flee is Qatar. The Sunni countries won't take them in. All right, maybe Russia would take in a few of the top leaders like they took in Assad. Possibly. All right. But where is the rest of your army going to go? The Guard Corps and the Basij and all the rest that are considered the most loyal to the regime. We're talking here of hundreds of. So as we said in the last slide, right, the regime has no place to flee, and there are major socioeconomic issues. Now, as we know, demonstrations already have begun in Iran, and they most likely will get a lot worse based on the collapse of the rial. But moving ahead, the regime now has a problem of use it or lose it when we're talking about their ballistic missiles in particular. We shouldn't believe that the nuclear program could be revamped and ready to go within a couple of months. I would say that would be quite a bit of a stretch. But the ballistic missiles, and if they're not going to use them, then it's gone, especially if they're under extreme threat. And we'll see what happens. In the meantime, Hezbollah also has tens of thousands of rockets alongside the Iranians, and let's not forget the Houthis who are in Yemen. All those rockets fired together, even with Israel's multi-layered defense systems, right? From Iron Beam with the short-range rockets using the lasers, all the way up to the Arrow 3, can be overwhelmed. And we were overwhelmed last time 2 or 3 times when there were far too many rockets fired, and of course they landed all over center of the country. Weizmann Institute, as well as Haifa, Ramat Gan, Haifa port. Okay, there were a lot of damage was done. Yes, we took out 95%, but if you're firing tens of thousands of rockets, then 95% sounds very good until you take into consideration what 5% damages can bring you. Okay, and here we're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. After all, we said the war cost Israel $12 billion overall. That's the estimate at the moment. So Israel, in essence, needs a preemptive strike. And we know the meeting with Trump, Netanyahu, apparently Netanyahu has a green light. Israel has a green light to go ahead if threatened. It wasn't said outright, just go for it. There's a lot of space between how threatened is it a reasonable, often put in quotes, right, when you read the newspapers, threat or not. We consider anything reasonable if it's even 1 or 2 rockets fired. It's interesting how there's a double standard, right? As if Israel could absorb a few rockets being fired. No, none. We know that the Iranians, they're not going to be able to hold back, not this regime. So Israel needs, of course, Western and U.S. support, which it has. Europe says so, not as loudly, but as the Iranian regime will begin to go under, and it will, okay? We don't know the exact timeline, obviously. Not a prophet here. But as that happens, the pro-Western forces in Iran will convince the Europeans, as well as the North Americans, that this is over. Okay, it's going to be very embarrassing also. We'll have a whole webinar about that also, how the West basically betrayed Iran. Okay, once this whole thing is over, take it a few months from now. I've got time to put it together. Okay, Qatari interests, Turks in Gaza, international stabilization force. Now, Netanyahu obviously has to give something to Trump. And what Trump wants is that the Turks are in Gaza. And apparently Israel is going to have its arms bent, even broken, and that will be forced on this full right-wing government, unless they want a full clash with the American regime. Secondly, Qatari interests. They want to rebuild Gaza, meaning they're going to have a lot of influence there. Something else that Israel is going to be forced to give into, quite possibly. Now, we'll see. It may not exactly work out this way. Let's hope it does not. because if Iran goes under and Israel doesn't have to do anything, it's quite possible that Israel could take certain steps and convince the American administration that no, the Turks, the Qataris, and all of them need to be put aside. After all those Islamists are going under, and there's no reason not to take more wins along the way. But we simply don't know. Let's recall, Qatar and Turkey are worth a lot more to the United States than Israel is, with all the compliments mutually between the two leaders and how they're giving prizes to each other and on and on. Okay? And the question always is, who strikes first, Israel or Iran? Israel will know if Iran's getting ready for a strike. After all, you have to deploy missiles. The question will be whether Israel has to wait until missiles are fired. It appears that that will not be the case. So we are all in a waiting game here. And right now, the events in Iran are setting the tone. How far they will go, we don't know. The regime, from what I can see, will pretty well fight to the end because there's nowhere to flee to, except maybe Qatar. And that will, of course, change the game quite a bit because once they arrive in Qatar, there'll be the perspective, right? And the way people will see this extremist Iranian regime now in exile under the Qataris won't look good for them as being, quote, pro-West. I'll throw in one more aspect. If Iran, when it goes under, there'll be a lot of contracts there. And one should certainly believe that that's what the Americans are looking for in rebuilding the infrastructure in Iran, just like they want to in Syria and to edge out the Chinese or anybody else. We can imagine the Europeans will be involved with it as well. So this concludes our seminar, more or less. Moving along, we always have our credits. People do work and we need to show appreciation. Here we go. And the Naaman Academy schedule. We have, of course, today's seminar is there. On Sunday, January 4th, it's free, no class. January 11th is for Naaman Academy students. I suggest people sign up, become one of our students. We have great discussions all the time. The 18th, we're free. And then January 25th is our next webinar. We'll be dealing with issues concerning the origins of jihad, but actually the period just previous to then when Islam was much more moderate, especially towards Jews and Christians. And here is where the answer to the clash between Islam and the rest of the world. It's part of Islamic history that's sort of been sidelined. Come to the webinar. We'll get lots of info about it. And we have free downloads on our digital store, ebooks. Take a look. Islamic Jihad, Beginnings, the Conquest, the Agenda. We also have the Gaza Genocide Lie, tons of statistics explaining how the Palestinian population has really prospered and grown since 1967, whether it be in Israel itself, Gaza, or West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and taking the statistics of the last 2 years and proving that there is no genocide. Okay, yes, there's a war. Yes, innocents are killed. We know there's no genocide. Okay, then we have anti-Semitism timeline, part 1, instigators, myths, and sources, how it impacts the Jewish community, and by the way, the world as well. And not so fun facts, we call it, part 2 about anti-Semitism, the lies, the myths, the half-truths, how to respond. And the book that I wrote years ago about Hamas Jihad, where it was clear to me that they will never give up. We have several chapters that are up. You can just download them, and we'll be adding a few more. And of course, we have our courses, which give an in-depth understanding about anti-Semitism from Farah to Facebook. Take the whole 3,500 years, show how anti-Semitism in one understanding, let's say, has evolved. Okay. However, it always morphs and goes back to basic Jew hatred, and it's explained there why. So you can really learn a tremendous amount, and lots of research went into it. Likewise, exposing Islamic jihad and safeguarding humanity, which we have 13 weeks of. The anti-Semitism is 6. And here, go through the history of jihad, and all the damage, the conquest, the imperialism, the destruction of other peoples, and the forced Islamization of a good portion of the world, and all those claims about everybody else being imperialist. Well, I have news for everybody. The greatest, most vicious imperialists that ever were these jihadis over a 1400-year period. And unfortunately, they want to reboot the caliphate today as well. Here from the Nauman Academy, wishing you the best. Have a good one, and